Hey guys, Johnny Crims 2000 here. Welcome back to Capcom Arcade Classics Volume 1, my personal retrospective of some of Capcom's best arcade games. Today I'll be giving you guys a brief history of Final Fight, a series which revolutionized the beat-em-up genre, while at the same time leaving a big mark on the Capcom world with its crazy cast of characters. But did you know that it was supposed to be a sequel to another Capcom series? So let's begin finding out about this Capcom classic. Final Fight was originally released in arcades in 1989 and was the 7th game released for the CPS-1 arcade board. But before I start talking about Final Fight itself, it's important to look at how the game could have been. Final Fight was not intended to be its own series. This game started life as a direct sequel to the original Street Fighter. The working title was Street Fighter 89. The game was meant to be a fighting game, much like the original, but after the success of Double Dragon, the decision was made to change it to a beat-em-up instead. Realizing that the game had become vastly different, Capcom decided to instead make it independent from Street Fighter, now going by the title of Final Fight. Although it was no longer a Street Fighter game, there are still a few leftovers from its time as a Street Fighter sequel. The intro to Street Fighter 2 shows what appears to be a character that looks surprisingly like Cody, which could imply that this intro was meant to be in the original version of Final Fight, back when it was intended to be a Street Fighter sequel. More on this relationship later on. Another bit of inspiration came in the form of the 1984 film Streets of Fire. Many elements, including the story of a young woman being kidnapped by a gang, were taken directly from this film. Some of the characters, including Cody, were heavily inspired by the movie as well. The development team behind Final Fight confirmed this inspiration when they admitted being fans of the film. Other than this film, other pieces of fun origin trivia include the Andores being inspired by the legendary pro wrestler Andre the Giant, Guy's name and look being inspired by Kai Picciotto from the band Fugazi, Sodom's pants coming from Jack Burton from the movie Big Trouble in Little China, and many other small details having origins in rock music. Final Fight itself proved to be a massively popular and influential game after being released, and had many things to help it stand out when compared to Double Dragon, who was the reason it became a beat-em-up in the first place. For one thing, the graphics were vastly superior and included large, well-detailed sprites. Instead of two twin brothers, Final Fight focused on 3 different characters: Cody, Guy, and Mike Hagar. The storyline is fairly simple. Metro City Mayor Mike Hagar receives a phone call from the Mad Gear Gang after they capture his daughter Jessica. Filled with rage, the ex-pro wrestler turned politician, long before Jesse Ventura I might add, sets out to stop the Mad Gear Gang with the help of Jessica's boyfriend Cody and ninjutsu practitioner Guy, and this is where the player comes in. In Final Fight, you choose one of the 3 main characters, each with their specific strengths and weaknesses. Cody is the most well-rounded and is able to use knives better than the other 2. He's able to stab instead of just throwing it. Guy is the fastest of the 3 and is able to pull off a wall jump kick, and Hagar is the slowest but the strongest, and because he's a pro wrestler, his throw techniques can be really devastating. From a gameplay perspective, this ensured that you could play the game differently every time you played, since the differences between the characters weren't purely aesthetic. Aside from these differences, every character can jump, attack, perform a grab and throw, and a desperation move by pressing both the jump and attack buttons at the same time, at the cost of some life. The game also allowed for 2-player action, allowing the game to be played with 2 of the 3 characters at once, which meant that a good bit of strategy could take place utilizing each character's strengths to make the game a bit easier to deal with. There are 6 stages in total, with 2 bonus stages thrown in between. Each stage is set in a different part of the city, like the slums, the subway, or going up a construction zone. The bonus stages are really just meant to get points, which come in handy when trying to get lives, and consist of a room with glass panels which have to be hit dead center in order for them to break, and the second bonus stage should be familiar to Street Fighter fans. It's the classic car beat-em-up game which debuted in Street Fighter 2. Each stage consists of several enemies and a boss at the end. This game is not skimpy when it comes to enemies and will oftentimes push the hardware by having a large number of enemies on screen at once. On that note, each enemy had their own method of attack, so a bit of strategy was required in how you dealt with them. Fortunately, you could pick up weapons which you could use for a limited time in order to even things out, and you could find food in order to regain health. Still, this game, like many other arcade games, was a quarter muncher and demanded time, skill, and most importantly, your loose change in order to complete it. As far as home ports are concerned, Final Fight is probably the most ported arcade game from Capcom's library, after Street Fighter of course. In total, Final Fight has been ported to no less than 13 different consoles at the time of this writing. The first home port was the Super NES version, which was released in 1990 in Japan, 1991 in America, and 1992 in Europe. This version has the bad distinction of being one of the worst port attempts that Capcom has ever done, due to both system limitations and attempting to rush the game out in time for the system's launch. Aside from looking and sounding like the original arcade version, this version took out many of the things that made Final Fight so great. For starters, the game now only has two playable characters, Cody and Mike Hagar, leaving Guy completely out. Not only was this disappointing to any Guy fans, but players were now left without the agile character. To make matters worse, the game no longer supported two players, making this a strictly one-player affair. Not only was this counterintuitive to how the game was supposed to be played, and what makes a good beat-em-up game, but it meant that this game was even harder to complete without getting any help from a friend. Guy wasn't the only character cut either. Relento, along with the entirety of Stage 4, was removed as well. There weren't as many enemies on screen at the same time, and censorship was abundant. These included the female characters Poison and Roxy being replaced by male enemies Billy and Sid, Sodom and Damned being renamed Katana and Thrasher respectively, Bread screaming "Oh my car" instead of "Oh my god" during the car bashing minigame, Belger's wheelchair being redrawn to look like an office chair, and all references to blood and alcohol being completely removed. Later, in 1992, Capcom decided to make a revised edition to Final Fight for the Super NES known as Final Fight Guy. This version saw the return of Guy as a playable character, but this time Cody was the one that became missing. Aside from this small change, the game was identical to the original version, and it had all the shortcomings as before. In a strange twist of fate, this game was initially only made available through rental at Blockbuster stores, with a very limited release afterwards, and can go for quite a bit of money nowadays due to its rarity on websites like Amazon and eBay. The next major port of Final Fight came to the ill-fated Sega CD add-on for the Sega Genesis. It was published by Sega themselves and released in 1993. This version remains quite faithful to the original arcade version, especially when compared to the butchered Super NES port. This version restored everything that had been taken out of the Super NES version, including all three characters being selectable, two-player mode, Relento, and the entirety of the industrial level. It also added some nice enhancements which were exclusive to this version of the game. The Sega CD version added an extra time attack mode which challenged players to beat up as many enemies as possible in the allotted time. Due to the CD format, this version also added voiceover work for the intro and introduced a completely remixed soundtrack. The only noticeable problems with this conversion were some decreased graphical quality due to the Sega CD's limited color palette, censorship still being prominent in the American version, and attacks coming out a bit slower during combos. Aside from these small nitpicks, this was easily the best home port for Final Fight for a long time due to the conversion quality and the added content. Aside from the two main consoles, Final Fight was also ported to almost every major home computer for the European market in 1993. Versions of Final Fight saw a release on the Commodore 64, the ZX Spectrum, the Amiga, the Atari ST, and the Amstrad CPC. All these conversions were handled by US Gold, who was known for handling many computer ports for Capcom's arcade games at the time. Each one of these ports retained the three selectable characters and featured a two-player co-op mode, something that the Super NES version lacked. These versions all ranged in quality, and none ever got close to being arcade perfect. The graphics ranged from passable to outright ugly. One common trait that these versions had was that they all relied on a strange one-button layout in conjunction with the joystick, which meant that the controls were not as reliable as those of the arcade or home consoles, making some of these games harder to beat. A separate version for the Sharp X68000 was released by Capcom exclusively for Japan in 1992. This was the closest that any home conversion got to being arcade perfect, as the hardware for the X68000 was very similar to many arcade machines out at the time. In fact, Capcom themselves used the X68000 in order to develop games for both the CPS-1 and CPS-2 arcade boards. Because of this, the X68000 version of Final Fight was the closest the game could get without being played on the arcade cabinet itself. Jumping ahead to 2001, an updated version of Final Fight was released for the Game Boy Advance known as Final Fight 1. This version brought back everything that had been missing in the Super NES version, including multiplayer, all three selectable characters, stage transitions, and the industrial level in its entirety. Two-player mode was handled through the use of a link cable, and many new additions were made to liven things up. For starters, Capcom included new dialogue scenes prior to each boss battle and is unique depending on which character you choose, making the story much more prominent in this version of the game. The game also included a very useful save feature which made things a bit easier for playing on the go. There was also several extra features which could be unlocked by earning fighting points. These features including starting off with 9 lives, a stage select option, a color change option, and a rapid punch option. Aside from this, after defeating a certain amount of enemies, you could unlock the Street Fighter Alpha versions of both Cody and Guy. Aside from a new look, playing as these new characters also gave you new dialogue scenes, this time told from the perspective of Cody and Guy as if they had gone back in time, which makes sense in the context of the Final Fight and Street Fighter storyline. The only downside to this version of the game was the music taking a noticeable hit due to the GBA's poor audio quality, some issues with the translation in some of the dialogue scenes, and both Poison and Roxy still being absent from the American versions. An emulated version of Final Fight was ported to the PlayStation 2 and Xbox as part of Capcom Classics Collection Volume 1, and to the PlayStation Portable as part of Capcom Classics Collection Remixed. These versions of Final Fight also added unlockable artwork, tips, cast profiles, and the ability to listen to the game's soundtrack. A poorly emulated version was also included as an unlockable in 2006's Final Fight Streetwise for the PlayStation 2 and Xbox. This version, however, suffered from horrible frame rate issues and is best ignored. Interestingly, the butchered Super NES version of Final Fight was made available on the Wii Virtual Console in 2007. And finally, the arcade version of Final Fight was made available on Xbox Live Arcade and PSN in 2010, bundled together with Magic Sword as part of Final Fight Double Impact. This version added graphical filter options, a new arranged soundtrack, the ability to play multiplayer online, an arcade cabinet view, and new time and score challenges. Up to this point, this has since become the definitive version of Final Fight if you're looking to play a quality version outside of the original arcade cabinet. So in a first for my retrospective series, this is only part 1 of my brief history of Final Fight. There's just so much information on the series that it had to be divided into 2 parts. So stay tuned for part 2 where I'll briefly go over Final Fight's sequels and where you can see Final Fight's influences outside of its own series. This has been Johnny Crimson 2000 and thank you for watching. As always, if you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to my channel if you want to get more stuff from me. In the meantime, if you like my videos, be sure to find me on Twitter, Tumblr, Raptr, and Screwattack.com to see the other gaming related content that I upload. Info is in the description. Who knows? Maybe you'll like my stuff. Maybe? Maybe?